The biggest mistakes in life don't come from what you see, but from what you think you understand in a single glance. Ethan Carter believed he had a gift. He could read people in seconds. Living in a fast-moving city like Chicago taught him that time was money and hesitation was weakness. Every morning, he walked nearly half a mile from his apartment to his office, scanning faces, judging intentions, making quick decisions about who mattered and who didn't. It made him feel sharp, in control, almost untouchable. To him, people were simple. You just had to look close enough, or so he thought. One cold morning, as the wind cut through the streets and the city rushed around him, Ethan noticed a man standing near the entrance of his office building. The man wore a worn-out coat, shoes that had clearly seen better days, and his posture seemed tired, almost invisible to the crowd passing by. For a brief second, their eyes met, and in that exact moment, Ethan's mind did what it always did. It decided without asking, without waiting, without knowing anything. He's probably just another guy looking for money or causing trouble, Ethan thought as he tightened his grip on his coffee and kept walking. But something about the man lingered just for a second. A small voice in the back of Ethan's mind whispered, "What if you're wrong?" But Ethan ignored it. He had trusted his instincts his whole life, and they had never failed him. At least that's what he believed. As he stepped closer to the building, the man spoke softly, asking for a moment of his time. Ethan didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. His decision had already been made long before the words reached him. Inside the building, everything looked the same: polished floors, quiet elevators, people moving with purpose. Ethan felt right at home, confident, prepared, ready for another important day. He had no idea that the one decision he made in less than 2 seconds outside that door was about to follow him upstairs into a room that would change everything, not because of what he did, but because of what he assumed. And deep down, the question he ignored was still waiting. What if you're wrong? The elevator ride felt longer than usual, even though it only climbed 20 floors. Ethan stood still, watching the numbers light up one by one, his mind already shifting to the meeting ahead. This was important, a potential partnership that could push his career forward, something he had been working toward for months. As the doors opened, he stepped into a quiet conference hallway where everything looked polished, controlled, predictable, just the way he liked it. Inside the meeting room, his manager, Laura, was already there reviewing documents. She looked up and gave a slight nod. "Ethan, you are right on time," she said, her tone calm but focus. "This is a big one today. Do not rush it." Ethan smiled with quiet confidence. "I will handle it," he replied, taking his seat. He believed that more than anything. He always did. A few minutes passed, and then the door opened slowly. Ethan glanced up, expecting someone sharp dressed, confident, someone who looked like success. Instead, he froze for a split second as the same man from outside stepped into the room. The worn coat, the tired posture, the same quiet presence, but something was different now. The room itself seemed to shift as Laura immediately stood up with respect. "Mr. Howard, it is an honor to have you here," she said, extending her hand. Ethan felt something drop inside his chest, a subtle but heavy realization that moved faster than his thoughts could catch up. Mr. Howard shook her hand gently, then turned his eyes toward Ethan, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a calm awareness that made Ethan feel exposed in a way he could not explain. This was not just another man. This was the investor, the decision maker, the opportunity Ethan had been preparing for all along. And in that moment, every assumption Ethan had made replayed in his mind like a quiet echo. He remembered the way he looked at him, the way he dismissed him, the way he chose not to listen. Without saying a word, Ethan's confidence began to crack, not because anyone said anything, but because the truth was now impossible to ignore. The meeting began as planned. Numbers were discussed, strategies explained, but Ethan struggled to stay present. His thoughts kept drifting back to that single moment outside the building, how fast it happened, how certain he felt, and how wrong he might have been. Mr. Howard listened carefully throughout the discussion, occasionally asking thoughtful questions, his voice steady, measured, nothing like the image Ethan had created in his mind earlier. Finally, Mr. Howard leaned back slightly and looked directly at Ethan. "Tell me something," he said calmly. "How do you usually decide who deserves your time?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight Ethan was not ready for. He opened his mouth to answer, but paused because for the first time he was not sure what the right answer was anymore. Ethan felt the weight of the question settle in the room, as if everything else had faded away. "How do you usually decide who deserves your time?" It sounded simple, but inside his mind it echoed louder than anything else he had heard that morning. He wanted to answer quickly, the way he always did, confident, certain, in control, but something stopped him. For the first time in a long time, Ethan was not sure if his answer would reveal strength or expose a flaw he had never questioned before. He cleared his throat slightly and said, I try to read people quickly. I look at how they present themselves, their confidence, their energy. I make decisions based on that. Mr. Howard nodded slowly, not interrupting, not judging, just listening in a way that made Ethan feel even more aware of his own words and how limited they suddenly sounded. And how often are you right? Mr. Howard asked calmly. Ethan hesitated. The question seemed harmless, but it carried a deeper meaning. He had never measured his accuracy. He had only trusted his instincts because they felt right, not because they were proven. He shifted slightly in his seat and said, I believe I am right most of the time. Mr. Howard gave a small, thoughtful smile. Belief is a powerful thing, he said, but it is not always the same as truth. The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt different. It was not empty. It was heavy, filled with something Ethan could not ignore anymore. His mind drifted back to the moment outside the building. The brief eye contact, the instant judgment, the decision to walk away without even listening. He realized how fast it all happened. Less than 2 seconds, a lifetime of consequence built on a single assumption. Mr. Howard leaned forward slightly and placed his hands together. Let me ask you something else, he continued. Have you ever considered how many opportunities are hidden behind people you chose to ignore? Ethan felt a tightness in his chest, not from pressure in the meeting, but from the realization that he had never even thought about that question before. To him, people were either worth his time or not. There was no middle ground, no curiosity, no pause, just decision after decision built on surface impressions. Laura glanced at Ethan briefly, sensing the shift in the conversation, but she remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold. Mr. Howard continued, his voice calm, steady. You see, most people believe they are good judges of character, but what they are really judging is comfort, familiarity, what feels safe, what looks familiar, and what fits their expectations. Ethan listened carefully, now every word landing deeper than the last, because for the first time he could see himself clearly, not as someone in control, but as someone who had been moving too fast to notice his own blind spots. And then Mr. Howard added quietly, the problem is not that we judge people, the problem is that we stop there. We decide before we understand. And when we do that, we do not just misjudge others, we limit our own future. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of that truth, because deep down he knew this was not just about one moment outside the building. This was about a pattern, a habit, a way of thinking that had shaped countless decisions without him ever questioning it. And now, sitting across from the man he had dismissed only minutes earlier, Ethan began to understand that the real cost of his thinking might be far greater than one missed conversation. Ethan sat still, but inside his mind, everything was moving faster than ever. Each word Mr. Howard had spoken began connecting to moments Ethan had never questioned before. Faces he had dismissed, conversations he had avoided, chances he had never even realized he walked away from. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. His confidence had never been about understanding people, it had been about avoiding uncertainty. He preferred quick answers over real ones, quick judgments over patient observation, because it felt efficient, it felt powerful. But now that belief was starting to crack. Mr. Howard leaned back slightly, giving the room space, as if he knew Ethan needed time, not more words. Laura quietly closed her notebook, sensing that this meeting was no longer about numbers or strategy. It had turned into something deeper, something far more important. Ethan finally looked up, his voice slower than before, more careful. I never thought about it that way, he admitted. I always believed making fast decisions was a strength. Mr. Howard nodded gently. It can be, he said, but only when those decisions are built on understanding, not assumption. He paused for a moment, then added, there is a difference between seeing and knowing. Most people think they are the same, but they are not. Ethan felt that distinction settle into him, because he realized how often he had confused the two. Seeing a worn coat and deciding someone was unsuccessful, seeing hesitation and deciding someone was weak, seeing silence and deciding someone had nothing to say, all of it built on fragments, not truth. Mr. Howard continued, his tone calm but firm. When you judge someone too quickly, you are not just making a mistake about them, you are creating a limit for yourself, because you stop looking, you stop asking, and you stop learning. Ethan's mind returned again to the moment outside the building, the man asking for a moment of his time, and Ethan choosing to walk past him without even a second thought. That moment now felt heavier than anything else in the room, not because of who Mr. Howard was, but because of what Ethan had done. Without even realizing it, he had closed a door before even seeing what was behind it. Mr. Howard then asked one final question. What do you think would have happened if you had stopped for just 10 seconds? Ethan did not answer right away because for the first time he was not trying to defend himself. He was trying to understand. He imagined it. Clearly stopping, listening, responding like a human being instead of reacting like a filter. And in that simple shift, he could see a completely different outcome, a different conversation, a different beginning. The realization was quiet but powerful. It was not about losing an opportunity. It was about recognizing how easily he could lose many more if nothing changed. And as that thought settled in, Ethan began to understand that the real test was not what he would say in this room, but what he would choose to do the next time he faced a moment that looked ordinary but was not. Ethan took a slow breath as the room settled into silence again, but this time, the silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt necessary. Like a pause before something important begins, he looked at Mr. Howard not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who had just revealed a truth he could not ignore. I think I would have listened, Ethan finally said, his voice quieter than before. I would have at least given you a moment. Mr. Howard studied him carefully, not with judgment, but with a calm curiosity that made Ethan feel seen in a different way. That is where everything begins. Mr. Howard replied, not with big actions, not with perfect decisions, but with a moment of willingness to understand. He paused briefly, then added, most people believe respect is something you give after someone proves their worth, but the truth is respect is what allows you to see their worth in the first place. Ethan felt those words settle deeper than anything else because they challenged something he had always believed without realizing it. He had been waiting for people to prove themselves before he gave them attention, before he gave them time, but now he saw how flawed that approach was because it meant he might never see the value in someone who did not fit his expectations from the start. Laura leaned slightly forward, listening closely as the conversation unfolded. This was no longer about a business decision. It was about a shift in perspective, one that could change far more than a single meeting. Mr. Howard continued in a calm, steady tone, when you slow down and choose to understand instead of judge, something interesting happens. You begin to notice things you would have missed before, small details, real signals, not just appearances. Ethan nodded slowly as memories began surfacing again, moments where he had overlooked people who later turned out to be important, times when he dismissed ideas that could have made a difference, all because they did not come in a form he expected. He realized how much he had filtered the world through a narrow lens, one built on speed and assumption rather than awareness and patience. Mr. Howard then leaned back slightly, giving Ethan space to absorb everything. But he was not finished. There is another side to this, he said quietly. When you judge people too quickly, you do not just lose opportunities, you also lose connection, and over time that distance grows until you start believing the world is exactly as limited as your judgments. Ethan felt a subtle shift inside him, as if something he had always relied on was now being replaced with something new, something unfamiliar, but necessary. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at Mr. Howard. What should I do differently? He asked, not as someone trying to impress, but as someone genuinely ready to learn. Mr. Howard smiled slightly, not because he had all the answers, but because Ethan was finally asking the right question. Next time you feel certain about someone, he said, pause just for a few seconds, ask yourself what you might be missing and give that moment a chance, because sometimes 10 seconds of patience can change the direction of everything. And as those words settled in, Ethan understood that the real lesson was not about this meeting, it was about every moment that would come after it. Moments that would look ordinary but carry choices that mattered far more than he had ever realized. Ethan left the meeting room with a feeling he could not fully explain. It was not relief, and it was not pressure. It was awareness, the kind that lingers quietly and changes how you see everything without announcing itself. As he walked down the hallway, the same polished floors now felt different, not because they had changed, but because he had the elevator doors opened, and as he stepped inside, he caught his reflection in the mirror for a brief moment. He looked at himself not with confidence, but with curiosity, as if he was seeing someone he thought he knew, but never truly understood before. The ride down was silent, but his mind was not. He kept replaying the words, 10 seconds of patience, what you might be missing, the difference between seeing and knowing, each idea looping back to the same realization. He had been moving too fast for too long, not just in work, but in how he saw people, how he filtered the world, and decided what mattered and what did not. When the elevator reached the ground floor, the doors opened, and Ethan stepped out slowly, this time Not rushing, not scanning, not judging, just observing. The lobby felt more alive than before, people moving in different directions, each one carrying something unseen, something unknown. And for the first time, Ethan did not feel the need to label any of it. He simply noticed it as he approached the entrance. His steps slowed even more because he knew what was waiting outside, not a person, not a situation, but a choice, the same kind of moment he had faced earlier. But now with a different awareness, the cold air greeted him again as he stepped onto the sidewalk. And there, near the same spot, stood another man. Different face, different clothes, but a similar presence, someone most people would pass. Without a second thought, Ethan felt the old instinct rise quickly, the automatic judgment forming almost instantly. But this time he caught it, he noticed it before it turned into a decision, and for a brief second, everything paused, just like Mr. Howard had said 10 seconds. That was all it took. Ethan took a small step forward. Instead of walking past, he stopped and looked directly at the man, not searching for flaws, not scanning for signals, but simply present. The man looked up, slightly surprised, as if he was not used to being acknowledged. "Can I help you with something?" Ethan asked, his voice calm and genuine. The words felt simple, but the moment felt different, because this time there was no assumption behind them, just openness. The man hesitated for a second, then asked for directions, his voice steady, respectful. Ethan listened carefully and responded, pointing him in the right direction. The interaction lasted less than a minute, but as the man walked away, Ethan felt something shift inside him, not because of who the man was, but because of what Ethan had chosen to do differently. It was a small moment, almost invisible to everyone else, but to Ethan it meant everything, because for the first time he had not let his thoughts control his actions. He had paused, he had chosen, and in that choice, he realized something powerful. Change does not come from knowing more, it comes from seeing differently in the moments that seemed too small to matter. And as Ethan stood there watching the city move around him, he understood that this was only the beginning of a different way of living, one decision at a time. Ethan stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds longer than usual, not because he had nowhere to go, but because something inside him was still adjusting. The city moved the same way, cars passing, people rushing, conversations blending into the background. But his attention had shifted. He was no longer scanning for quick conclusions. He was noticing details, small ones, the kind he used to ignore. A man helping someone pick up dropped papers, a woman pausing to check on a stranger who looked lost, a delivery driver smiling even while carrying a heavy load. These were moments Ethan would have filtered out before because they did not fit into his fast judgment system. But now they felt different, they felt real. As he began walking again, his pace was slower, not forced, just natural, like his mind was finally catching up with the world around him. Every few steps, he noticed how quickly his old habits tried to return. A glance at someone's clothes, a tone of voice, a posture, and instantly his mind would start forming a conclusion. But now there was a space between that thought and his action, a small gap where he could choose whether to accept the judgment or question it. And that gap was where everything began to change. He passed by a small coffee stand on the corner, a place he had walked by hundreds of times without ever stopping. Today, he paused not because he needed coffee, but because he realized he had never actually noticed the person running it. The barista looked up with a simple smile and greeted him as if he had always been a regular. Ethan returned the smile and ordered a cup, taking a moment to ask how the day was going. It was a short conversation, nothing extraordinary, but as he stood there waiting for his coffee, he realized something surprising. The interaction felt more genuine than many of the conversations he had in his office, where everything was structured and calculated. When the barista handed him the cup, Ethan said thank you and meant it, not as a habit, but as a choice. As he walked away, he thought about how many times he had overlooked simple human moments like this because he was too focused on efficiency, too focused on deciding quickly who mattered and who did not. And now that idea seemed incomplete, almost flawed, because value was not always obvious. It was not always dressed in confidence or success. Sometimes it was quiet, sometimes it was hidden in ordinary moments that required patience to see. As Ethan turned the corner heading back toward his apartment, he realized that what had changed was not the world around him, it was the way he was choosing to move through it. And that difference began with something so small it almost felt insignificant, a pause, a question, a willingness to not know right away. And in that realization, Ethan understood that growth does not always come from big dramatic changes. Sometimes it begins in the quiet decision to slow down and see clearly before deciding what something means. Ethan arrived home later that evening, but instead of turning on the television or checking his phone like he usually did, He sat quietly near the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The same city that once felt predictable now seemed layered with meaning. Every person he had passed, every face he had overlooked began to feel like a story. He never took the time to read his mind, returned once again to the moment outside the office that morning. But this time it was different. He was not replaying it with regret. He was studying it with awareness, trying to understand how something so small could reveal something so important about the way he had been living. He realized that his problem was never about being wrong once, it was about being certain too quickly. That certainty had given him a false sense of control, but it had also limited what he could see, what he could learn, and who he could become. As that thought settled in, Ethan stood up and walked over to his desk where a stack of old notes and plans sat untouched for weeks. These were ideas he once dismissed because they did not feel right at the time, projects he abandoned because he judged them too early without giving them space to grow. He picked one up and looked at it again, not with the same critical eye, but with curiosity, asking himself a simple question: what if I was wrong about this too? The question felt unfamiliar but powerful because it opened something that had been closed for a long time, a possibility that growth was not just about doing more, but about seeing differently, even within his own thoughts. He sat down and began reading slowly, noticing details he had ignored before, connections he had missed, patterns that only became clear when he allowed himself to stay with the idea longer than he normally would. And in that quiet moment, Ethan understood something that extended beyond people, beyond opportunities, and into every part of his life. Judgment was not just something he applied to others, it was something he applied to everything: ideas, experiences, even himself. And every time he rushed to a conclusion, he closed a door that might have led somewhere meaningful. The realization was not overwhelming, it was steady, like a shift in direction rather than a sudden change. He was not trying to become someone completely different. He was simply choosing to be more aware, more patient, more open to what he did not immediately understand. And as the night grew quieter, Ethan felt a sense of clarity that did not come from having all the answers, but from finally asking better questions, questions that slowed him down just enough to see what had always been there, but never noticed before. And in that stillness, he realized that the way forward was not about moving faster, it was about pausing long enough to truly understand before deciding what something meant. The next morning arrived like any other, but to Ethan it felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had. And as he stepped outside into the cool morning air, he carried with him a quiet awareness that followed every step he took. The city was already alive, people moving quickly, chasing schedules, making decisions just as he used to. But now Ethan noticed something he had never truly seen before. Behind every rushed step, every focused expression, there was a story, something unseen, something unknown, something that could not be understood in a single glance. As he walked toward his office, he saw a familiar figure standing near the entrance, the same place where everything had started. Mr. Howard was there again, not waiting, not expecting, just standing calmly, as if time moved differently around him. This time, Ethan did not hesitate. He walked forward with intention, stopping just a few feet away. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice steady but sincere. Mr. Howard looked at him and smiled, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if he had already seen this change before. "Good morning," he replied simply. Ethan paused for a moment, not because he did not know what to say, but because he wanted to choose his words carefully. "Yesterday I made a decision too quickly," Ethan said. "I thought I understood something without really seeing it." Mr. Howard nodded gently. "That happens more often than people realize," he said. "But what matters is not the mistake, it is what you do after." Ethan took a small breath and continued, "I think I am starting to understand that now." Mr. Howard looked at him for a moment, then said, "Understanding is not something you reach once, it is something you practice every day in moments that seem small but carry weight." Ethan let those words settle because he knew they were true. This was not about one conversation or one realization. It was about a new way of moving through life, a way that required patience, awareness, and a willingness to question his own thoughts before turning them into decisions. As they stood there, the morning continued around them. But for Ethan, everything felt clearer, not simpler, not easier, but more real. He realized that every person he would meet, every situation he would face would offer the same quiet choice: to judge quickly or to understand slowly. And that choice would shape not just his actions, but his direction. Mr. Howard then added one final thought: people are rarely what they seem at first glance, and neither are opportunities if you only see what It's obvious you will miss what truly matters. Ethan nodded slowly because he had lived that truth without knowing it, and now he had seen the other side not through theory, but through experience. As he walked into the building this time, Ethan did not feel the need to rush. He did not feel the need to decide everything instantly. Instead, he carried a simple reminder with him, one that would guide him far beyond this moment. Every thought becomes a judgment. Every judgment becomes an action, and every action shapes the path you walk. But if you pause long enough to truly see, you might discover that the path you almost missed was the one meant for you all along.